E ngaiwi o te motu o te ao tēnā koutou katoa a nau maira. Kia ora, hello and welcome. My name is Julian Wilcox and it's an absolute privilege to be hosting this very special webinar, the European Commission Sustainable Food Webinar. The European Union and Aotearoa, New Zealand are separated by geography, but united by shared pride in their strong agricultural roots and traditions. Now, as the world faces the existential challenges of climate change, how can we embrace these traditions during the transition to a more sustainable agricultural model? How do we deal with environmental remediation of our soils and water, biodiversity, loss, and ensuring food security? And how can one be inspired by an Indigenous approach to sustainability? We're going to meet some of the leaders in sustainable agriculture throughout this webinar from Aotearoa, New Zealand and the EU and discuss those key questions. First, we'll be hearing from two of our keynote speakers. They are Assistant Professor Dr. Jeroen Candel of Wageningen University and Dr. Jessica Hutchings of Kaiatua Food for Hope and Wellbeing. And then we'll move to a panel discussion with 6 guests from Aotearoa, New Zealand and overseas as well. Now, remember, you can also send us your questions. You can type your questions at any time and we will put them to our speakers at the end. So let's move now to our first presentation today. It is from Dr. Jeroen Candel, Associate Professor in Food and Agricultural Policy at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. In his research, he studies how governments from local to EU level can support a transition towards a more sustainable food system. In his most recent publications, he has reflected on the groundbreaking potential of the EU's farm to fork strategy and provided recommendations for improvements of the common agricultural policy. Moreover, he was one of the authors of the SAPIA report, A Sustainable Food System and the European Union. Let's now hand over to you, Dr. Jeroen Candel. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Julian, and it's a big pleasure to join you from the Netherlands. I will quickly share my screen. If you have 1 second, then it should appear any second. So, well, it's a big pleasure to be here, and in the next 30 minutes or so, I would like to walk you through the the policy developments going on in the EU that I think will have a huge impact on not only the EU's food system, but also that of countries outside of the EU, notably New Zealand, which is a big importer to the EU. And I will especially be talking about the EU's farm to fork strategy, which is a very new food system strategy that's been published 2 years ago as part of the EU's Green Deal. So I'd like to start by taking a step back and say a bit more about the EU's Green Deal. The Green Deal is I would say a huge policy package, which is the flagship program of the current European Commission, which has the aim of making the EU climate neutral by 2050, and by doing so also radically innovating the EU's economy. So to really invest in sustainable businesses, a sustainable society that will reduce its carbon footprint. Now, and of course, if we talk about such a huge transition, we cannot escape also debating the food system, as it's one of the main drivers of climate emissions, as well as a number of other challenges. So if we look at the EU food system, we see that agriculture in itself is responsible for about 10% of the EU's greenhouse gas emissions. We know that globally, the food system as a whole, so that also includes land use change, transport, processing of food, amounts to about a third of climate emissions, which means that if we want to tackle the climate problem, the climate crisis, we cannot escape transitioning the food system. There's a number of other challenges. We see huge biodiversity loss, especially of typical farmland species like farmland birds. We see quite strong pollution of air and water quality. I think the Netherlands is a very strong case where we see very many of these challenges coming together in a very small country, and at the same time also a social crisis, you could say. On the bottom right, you see a farmer protest in the Netherlands of last year. Farmers also protesting against the low wages, the fact that they've been that the relative prices of the products they produce have hardly increased over the last decades, and at the same time they are being confronted with these environmental challenges and the costs of addressing them. Health aspects, so we see an increase of diet-related disease. We could add many more: animal welfare, labor conditions in the food chain, etc. But I do not want to make this a very pessimistic story, because most of my talk will actually be about the policy solutions that are being provided to try to tackle some of these challenges in a holistic way. So if we look at the traditional approach in the European Union to the food system, to farming, we have to say that it's traditionally strongly fragmented. So already since the start of the European project in 1956, agriculture became one of the main pillars of European integration, so by adopting the Common Agricultural Policy. Now, since the late 1990s, that agricultural policy has been complemented by a food safety policy, resulting from the BSE crisis, the mad cow disease, which made European member states aware that they should invest in coordinating their food safety responses. More recently, we've also seen an increase of environmental policy, which of course has a huge influence on the functioning of the food system. We see that foods and agriculture are a major source of controversy in trade negotiations. Also one of the main reasons why multilateral trade negotiations under the WTO have stagnated for a long time. But traditionally, these different policy domains and these different policy efforts have remained strongly fragmented and working in different directions. And that is why in recent years, different think tanks, different groups of academics have called for the development of, well, what we could perhaps call a food policy. So rather than just having an agricultural policy and an environmental policy and a trade policy, try to address these interrelated challenges in a more integrated manner. So here you see two examples of reports that have been quite influential in the EU, one from my university, one from a think tank called IPAS Food, which called for either the development of a common food policy in addition to the common agricultural policy, or to change the common agricultural policy of the EU into a common agricultural and food policy. Now, we could say that the farm to fork strategy, which was presented in 2020 by the European Commission's Vice President Frans Timmermans, who is responsible for the, well, we could say the sustainability agenda under the Green Deal, and that this farm to fork strategy marks the first attempt ever at EU level to move towards something that we could call a food policy, which tries to tackle the food system in an integrated manner and not only target farmers, but also all of the other actors in the food chain, from processors, retailers to consumers. Now, if we look at this strategy, there's a whole range of goals, but the most striking are these. So by 2030, the European Commission aims for a reduction of chemical crop protection, pesticides by 50%, 50% reduction of nutrient losses, as well as a 20% reduction of chemical fertilizers, a 50% reduction in the use of antimicrobials, the increase of the amount of land under organic agriculture to 25% across the EU. And in an additional strategy, which is called the biodiversity strategy, also part of the Green Deal, the Commission also set the goal of allocating 10% of agricultural land for landscape features that benefit biodiversity. We see these hedgerows on the bottom right, which are, for example, very typical for agricultural landscapes in the Netherlands. Now, this is just an overview of current organic farming areas across the EU, and now we see that there's quite big differences. Countries such as Austria, Sweden already or almost making this 25% target, whereas, for example, the Netherlands, we see having a very small percentage of land under organic agriculture. Now, of course, this farm to fork strategy also has a very strong external dimension, among which in trade agreements. So one of the main complaints of farmers across the EU, or one of their worries, you could say, is that they would be faced with these increasing environmental standards, whereas the EU would at the same time open its borders to imports from outside of the EU, which possibly might not comply with the same standards. And that is why the EU is increasingly investing in ambitious sustainability chapters in its free trade agreements, in which it seeks commitments to animal welfare, pesticides reduction, reduced use of antimicrobials from its trade partners. And a very recent development is that the EU has also installed what is called an EU Chief Trade Enforcement Officer. So to make sure that these ambitions do not just stay with nice paper ambitions, but are also being enforced in practice. Now, of course, to many farmers, especially in the global south, in the developing world, it is quite a big challenge to meet these increased standards, and that is why the EU is at least promising to also help small-scale farmers, for example, in Africa and in the Pacific, to meet these standards, as well as investing in knowledge exchange. But I think it will be a real challenge to many small-scale farmers to meet these ambitions. Now, and we also know from studies within the political sciences that these standards might also diffuse through market mechanisms. We know that food chains are increasingly globalized, that multinationals operate across markets, and that this might also result in what is called a Brussels effect. So we see that in many domains, the standards of the EU tend to be quite ambitious, and that these also diffuse to other countries, because multinationals might, for example, desire that the standards across the chain are equal, and lobby domestic governments to harmonize their standards with the EU standards. And this is also a mechanism that the EU deliberately uses as a way of soft power to counter the economic and military power of, say, the US and China. So this is called the Brussels effect, and we know that in the food and environmental domains, this is quite a strong mechanism. Now, there's a couple of remarks that I should make about this strategy. First, a strategy, it sounds very, very big, it sounds very ambitious, but in legal terms, a strategy means very little in EU policy making. And for the strategy to become really effective, it first needs to be translated into laws, into legislation. And this is a stage that we've only recently entered. So this farm to fork strategy, as well as the biodiversity strategy, will in the coming years be translated into a number of EU laws. Now, and in that legal translation, we can actually expect quite big struggles between the different decision-making institutions at the EU level. So decision-making powers in most for most issues are divided between the European Parliament, which is elected by EU citizens, and by the member states represented in the Council. And these two institutions, they need to come to agreement on these different laws, on all these standards. And I expect quite a bit of watering down as well in the coming years. So it remains to be seen what the ambition levels will turn out to be. Now, apart from these new ambitions, there is already tons of environmental legislation in the EU. And we see that quite some member states, among which the Netherlands, already have big difficulties in meeting these old environmental standards. For example, in the Netherlands, we currently face quite a big nitrogen crisis, which has to do with the nitrogen deposition largely originating from livestock farming, having quite detrimental impacts on nature areas, and this has resulted into violation of EU nature legislation and currently putting a hold on all building permits in the Netherlands until the emissions of nitrogen is being reduced. So this is quite a big political crisis at the moment in the Netherlands. Now, important to note is also that the EU has only competence on some domains, such as agriculture and food safety, but not on others, such as consumer behavior, public health, food education. So to really foster a transition of the EU, of the food system as a whole, it will also rely on actions taken by the member states. And there we see that there's still quite big differences in the ambition levels between member states. With some, Sweden, the Netherlands, France, being relatively ambitious, while others much less so. Now, these are just some examples of laws that the EU will work on in the coming years to implement the farm to fork strategy. It has announced a big legal framework for sustainable food systems. And to me, this is also still a bit of a black box. I don't know what will be in it, but that is announced for 23. Adjustment of pesticide legislation, animal welfare legislation. So we can really expect standards to be increased in all of these different EU laws. Now, to end my presentation, I would like to walk you through some most recent developments. And a very recent development is the compromise that the European Parliament and the Council have found on the Common Agricultural Policy, which represents about a third of the European budget. And there we see that there's actually quite a strong mismatch between the ambitions in the farm to fork strategy and the Green Deal and the Common Agricultural Policy. So whereas the ambition of the European Commission was to sort of use these funds to realize its farm to fork ambitions, as we see in this cartoon, the reality is that these remain largely fragmented, and that we see that the deal as it's currently being struck, that funds will still largely be used to support the status quo in EU agriculture rather than helping farmers to make this transition towards more sustainable modes of agriculture, which is of course also being explained by the big fear among farmers that a loss of these subsidies will put their incomes further under pressure. But we see that for example, the targets on pesticides reduction, on the amount of land for biodiversity purposes has not translated into a different use of these farming subsidies. Although member states have quite a bit of space to still make implementation decisions at national level. Another very recent development is that a couple of weeks ago, the EU has also presented a deforestation-free products on the EU market strategy. And this means that for 6 commodities, which you see on the slide, businesses in the EU have to show that the products that they place on the European market have not gone at the cost of forests outside of the EU. You could think of Brazil, which has received a lot of media attention, Indonesia, a number of African countries. So this is really to try to tackle land use change as a result of our consumption and agricultural practices. And finally, we see that a lot is happening in EU trade policy. For example, the French President Macron, which will chair the Council of the European Union, which has a rotating presidency, who has announced that he wants to use the French presidency to change EU trade policy in such a way that imports of unsustainable products will be banned from the EU market, or that levies will be introduced. And this, of course, has everything to do with the French elections that will be held in next year, in which Macron also wants to protect himself from criticism that he's selling out French farmers by investing in a more sustainable food system at the EU level. So to recap, I've really walked you through these policy developments in a nutshell. There's of course much more to be said about this. So I also look forward to see what sort of questions emerge from the audience. But to recap, we've seen that the EU has recently really developed something that we could call a food system approach. Although, as I said, it still also largely relies on the member states, especially in also getting retailers and consumptions to change their practices. We saw that this has major international consequences through its effects on trade policy, through this Brussels effect. But at the same time, much is also still uncertain because the farm to fork strategy has only been recently introduced and will now have to be translated into legislation, where we can expect considerable clashes between the member states and between the institutions. So thanks a lot for your attention. I hope this was insightful, and I look forward to any questions that you might still have.
Jeroen, thank you very much for your presentation. We really do appreciate the presentation. And as you say, there is much more to be said. So we do welcome questions coming in from our audience. And now we've had one already come in, actually, and I'd like to put this on behalf of Aniek van Heenen, who asks, how did the momentum to adopt the F2F development and strategy, and how can we further stimulate similar developments?
Well, I think in the EU, this had everything to do with the climate agenda. So after the 2015 Paris Agreement on climate change and climate marches of youth movements across European cities, we saw a very big pressure on European politicians, both in the member states and at EU level, to take these climate concerns more seriously. And that is why the European Commission, and when it came into office in 2019, really embraced the climate agenda as its big priority for the coming years, and because of which it introduced this Green Deal. And well, if you want to make serious work of climate change, as I said, you cannot escape also fostering a food system transition. So I think civil society played a huge role in increasing pressure on politicians to take firmer action. So I think that will be one takeaway from what happened in Europe, that these youth movements, these civil society movements, can really have a big impact on political agendas and ultimately on policy change.
You also talked about the mismatch between the common agricultural policy and the food to fork strategy and the Green Deal. What might be the areas of prioritization or focus, do you think, to be able to build further the relationship between the two so you don't have this mismatch going forward? Is there an area that you could give us of prioritization or areas of prioritization or focus to be able to build that relationship and a closer alignment between the two?
Yeah, so we see that the common agricultural policy basically exists of two funds. One fund, which makes up about 90% of the budget, is largely used for income support, for market measures, and the other fund of about 10% is used for rural development, agro-environmental schemes, and other types of public goods. Now, I think the big challenge is to where we see that in this first larger fund, most money is used to support the status quo, that we really encourage this transition towards the use of funds really to help farmers producing these public goods, ecosystem services, climate mitigation, climate adaptation. So there's some increased space for that under the new Common Agricultural Policy, but compared to the proposals of the European Commission, we saw quite a strong watering down of these ambitions by especially the member states. So, well, all in all, I would say the current deal is quite disappointing, given the challenges that the EU faces. And well, member states will have to now come up with additional funding if they want to make serious work of the climate and biodiversity agendas.
And we've had a question aligned to that point, I think, Jeroen, which asks about the relationship or reaching out to farmers, informing them about these changes and creating a co-creation of strategies that will affect them. So what would your recommendation and expertise be to be able to help build that relationship further with farmers to enable them to be able to meet the targets and implement the farm to fork strategy?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of frustration with farmers that we know that many farmers, for example, the Netherlands, that they are very much willing to invest in more sustainable production manners, but they feel being as if they are stuck in the value chain, and they have a relatively weak position versus retailers. Their income is often below the average in other sectors. So what I think needs to be done is not make farmers only responsible for solving all of these environmental challenges, but really addressing all of the actors in the food chains, also retailers, also consumers. And currently we see that member states still take very little action to also change the consumption and retailing practices of these other actors. So I think if you really want to increase support among farmers, if you want to reduce the pressure on farmers, and if you really want to allow them to make this transition, you should not only try to realize more ambitious agricultural policy, but also complement agricultural policy with a real food policy, which also targets consumers and all of these other actors in the food chain.
Yeah, you mentioned complement, and I think it is a complementary approach, right? So
exactly.
Is a part of the really effective implementation for the strategy also a focus on the co-benefits that come from the developing market, the focus on sustainability, but also with consumers, right? The benefits of consumers adapting, adopting, and being able to access these really sustainable approaches to food production.
Yeah, ideally, yes. So I think that's also exactly what we need. We need a positive vision for the future of the food system that appeals to farmers, to consumers, because we know that behavioral change is very difficult. People don't like to change their behavior, to change their practices. We tend to stick to our routines. So in order to change people's behavior, people's practices, we need appealing visions. We need to help them to change their behavior. Sometimes we need to nudge them. Sometimes we need to change the incentives. So we see that also the prices of food, that the less sustainable, the less healthy options are still often cheaper than the sustainable options. So we need all of these interventions. But for sure, yes, we need more appealing visions to organize such a transition process.
And Jeroen, one final question, and this one has come in from my audience again, and thank you to the audience members for posing the questions and putting them to Jeroen. Now, Jeroen, the question relates to trade restrictions. I think on the slide you had with President Macron, you talked about, or there was mention of a restriction on food imports. The question is, how will trade restrictions, potential trade restrictions, affect trade with developing third countries, and will they be able to adhere to the new standards being sought now?
Yeah, I think that's a real concern. So the EU has a policy in which it gives privileged access to small-scale producers from the so-called ACP countries, so Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. But this is a real challenge to small-scale producers in the global south, who often lack the resources, the knowledge, the capacities to adjust their practices. So although on paper the EU is promising, the Commission is promising to help farmers in these countries to make this transition, I think in practice many farmers will struggle to do so, and that mainly the larger scale farmers will benefit. So this, of course, raises the question of how we can also help countries outside of the EU to foster such a transition in a fair way, which also helps to alleviate farmers under poverty levels. From poverty. So I think much remains to be done there.
Dr. Jeroen Candel, thank you very much for your presentation and for taking time to answer the questions from our audience today. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Big pleasure. Thank you.
We now move to Dr. Jessica Hutchings. Now, she is a descendant of Ngai Tahu, Ngāti Huirapa, and Gujarati. She is a kaupapa Māori researcher, activist, and hua parakore grower living on a small whānau farm in Kaitoke, which is just north of New Zealand's capital city, Wellington, Te Whanganui Aotearoa. Her PhD is in environmental studies, and she has worked for the last 2 decades in the Māori research sector, leading and supporting kaupapa Māori research to deliver transformation across diverse Māori communities. Now, she is skilled in biodynamics and is also a devotee and teacher of Ashtanga yoga. She helps steer, she's laughing now, and I'm glad I mentioned it actually. She helps steer Te Waka Kaiora, the National Māori Organics Authority of Aotearoa, an organisation committed to environmental and cultural sustainability. Ka hoki aku mahara ki taku matua. Arakia Percy Tipene. Her book, Te Mahi Mara Hua Parakore, a food sovereignty handbook, explores the practice of ensuring food secure futures for whānau and incorporates kōrero with other hua parakore growers. Let's now turn to Dr. Jessica Hutchings e te uri o tahu pōtiki tēnei te mihi kia koe kai a koe te wā.
Tēnā koe, Julian, koutou katoa, ka nui te mihi kia koutou. Thank you very much for the introduction. It's always amusing when your bio gets read out, and I don't know who put that in there, but yes, lovely, an Ashtanga yoga teacher with other hats on. So kia ora, everybody. I'm just going to ask Chris to share, ka pai, thank you, to share my presentation slides. So, I have a training in environmental studies through Western institutions, and I'm making a point, I suppose, to frame my background at the beginning, because I work very much in the interspace between Mātauranga Māori and Western science. I now call myself a recovering or a recovered academic, having spent probably a decade and a bit in the university system, and then actually making a really purposive decision to move out of that space to progress Māori development, decolonising work with Māori communities. So still undertaking research, but through a different knowledge lens and through a different standpoint. So today I want to talk about sustainable food systems through the hua parakore, which is how we might come to think about Māori organics. We don't actually use English terms to define kaupapa Māori or te reo Māori words, so we understand as Māori the hua parakore just as the hua parakore. It's our divine knowledge framework for producing kai atua, and kai is the Māori word for food, and atua is the Māori word for deity, for our world of deity figures that's all interconnected, and we're talking about food that's fit for the atua, that's from the atua. So food from the gods, for the gods, with people actually, Māori people, all humans, being that divine manifestation of the realm of ngā atua. So a very different standpoint from the other speaker, and as I was listening, I was thinking that there's a lot of work to do in thinking about how we bridge these spaces around Indigenous knowledge, the dominance of Western policy, and where we might be moving to in transitioning our food systems. So I want to start just very quickly by talking about my standpoint. As Julian said, I, he Aotearoa Ngai Tahu me Ngāti Huirapa, I hail from the South Island. I also too am from a village in India called Matwad, out on the Dandi coast in the state of Gujarat, otherwise known as a Mindian, a Māori Indian. Today I'm standing on our whānau whenua, which is called Papa Whakarito in Kaituki, just north of our capital city. But we are not Indigenous to the specific piece of land that we are on as a family. So we are. So today I'm standing on the traditional lands of Te Aotearoa, Rangitane, and Kahanunu ki Wairarapa. So my standpoint is that I'm a visitor on Indigenous land in this area because I'm outside of my tribal boundary. My work and my standpoint is not neutral. It's not value-free. I drive Indigenous self-determination wherever I can. Counter, I suppose, that false neutrality of Western science by making really explicit my positionality and my standpoint. And finally, I think the thing which is really shaping how I'm seeing the world at the moment is having 17 years on this farm up here, very small, 12 acres, where we feed whānau in different households around our area. So we really see ourselves now as farming photosynthesis through polycropping everything, farming carbon, drawing down where we can, and really farming soil microbes. So have a very deep relationship with Hiniahone, with the soil, with our deity of the soil that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. Kaiatua is the name of a research project that's funded from the Royal Society, Te Aparangi in Aotearoa, and it's called Kaiatua, Food for Hope and Wellbeing. And I really want to accentuate the notion of hope here, because I think in the time of a global pandemic, somebody said to me yesterday, we're in the era of pandemics, and we don't really know when this is all going to end. We need to be able to cultivate hope. And so working with Māori communities that I work with in the food and the agricultural space, we're really hopeful. We know that if we turn back to our Indigenous knowledge, back to the ways of our tūpuna and understanding their mātauranga, their traditional knowledges, and bring those practices to the fore in agriculture in Aotearoa, that it is regenerative, that it's sustainable, that it's organic, that it farms photosynthesis, that it draws down carbon. So Kaiatua, food for hope and well-being, and really underscoring the hope side within there. So this is our worldview. This is how I see the world. This is how maybe Julian, I'm sure, sees the world, how Te Ao Māori, how we frame our worldview. And when I look at this image that we have developed as through our project Kaiatua, Food for Hope and Wellbeing, I see what one of our scholars, Māori Marsden, talked about, and I see a woven universe where everything is completely interconnected, where it is framed and it is understood through the energies of our deity and our atua, where it is culturally located, where there is no disconnection between mountains and seas and rivers and land and people and deity and gods. And so this is a standpoint from which I am talking from. And when I'm listening about the international policy and the EU food and agricultural policy that's in development or, you know, having a progression through its pathways, I'm very much reminded of the international obligations that are available to, through example, through the UN draft Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Nagoya Protocol around protecting cultural and intellectual property rights of Indigenous people. And this is really important for us, for all Indigenous communities around the world, that the rights of Indigenous peoples through the declaration at the UN are upheld. And so I really, I suppose, pose that question to all of us who are working at the policy level is how do we ensure that those agricultural food sustainability policies are lining up to uplift the Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' rights, plus also the Nagoya Protocol, which New Zealand has yet to ratify, but we're very hopeful, which is about the protection of cultural and intellectual property rights. So just another beautiful slide with artwork here from Teresa Reihana, who's a member of Te Waka Kaiora. And I think for me, this really encapsulates who we are as the Māori Organics movement and our worldview. Don't really feel like it needs much explanation apart from to say that there is absolutely no separation from people from the land. We have a term in Aotearoa in New Zealand for Māori people being tangata whenua, tangata people, whenua land, people of the land. So we come from the land and we return to the land. And in actual fact, when I look at this slide and this image, I'm really reminded that there is actually no separation in any sense from Papa Tuanuku, our Earth Mother, kei waho rā, outside my window, and me as that embodied personification of Papa Tuanuku. But even more so, as a Huaparakore food grower, I look at this image and I see Hine Ahuone as well. So I see the energies of our deity of soil, Hine Ahuone, and again, there is no separation between us as tangata, as people, and that realm of the soul and that deity, Hine Ahuone. So I'm just stepping you through, I suppose, my standpoint and then also to the worldview from within which I'm talking from. So I just want to move into talking about the Huaparakore system, which is a kaupapa Māori or an Indigenous, a Māori verification and validation system for a pure product, or what we understand as being kai atua, food from the gods, fit for the gods, developed through a 3-year research project. It's been around for 11 years, 4 organic certification systems in Aotearoa, and not one of them provided an Indigenous pathway for Māori to tell our own story. And so what the Huaparakore does is it provides that pathway for Māori growers to tell a kaupapa Māori story. At a very high level, it's based on 6 kaupapa, and these 6 kaupapa are all interrelated. So you can't pick a mix and say, I'll just use that one, but I'll leave that one behind. Just going to run through them very quickly because I know this is all in Māori. But whakapapa is about genealogy and interconnections. In a farming context, we ask questions, for example, where do your seeds come from? What are the inputs, the whakapapa of the inputs, the genealogy of the inputs that you might be bringing into your farming system? Wider we think about in terms of health and safety, the wider the spiritual well-being of everybody who's working on the farm. That spiritual connection that farm workers have, not just working the land to actually produce food, but actually finding that connection as nature beings, as co-producers and co-creators with nature. I'll come back to maramatanga, but Māori is about life force and energy. It's used as an environmental performance indicator in Aotearoa to understand the well-being of water bodies, of soil, of air quality, and it's woven quite well into our environmental frameworks. Mana, I think about as social justice, about ensuring that we are lifting up and supporting people within that farming system. And Te Aotearoa is a reference to our natural world. It's all that interconnected natural world where I had those 2 slides at the beginning to underscore that. Circling back to maramatanga, which is one of the values and the principles that I think is really important within the Huaparakore and within Indigenous knowledge frameworks. And this is this idea when we come to know. So how do we know when Hine Ahuone is on a pathway to being restored? What is our sense of knowing? How do we connect? And as Julian acknowledged, our kaumatua, our elder who's now passed on from the Māori Organics group, Percy Tipene, he would always talk about how can we connect with our divine senses as farmers and as growers, as Māori organic producers, to be able to come to the sense of knowing, ka puta mai te maramatanga, things are clear. I can see what needs to be done. I can feel it in my vibration. I'm connected with my ancestors. I'm connected with deity, and my farming practices are working in a way which are actually uplifting and enhancing that whole interconnected Māori view. The Huaparakore system, like organic systems, is 3 years to transition all the way through it. Some of our whānau or families might just stay at year 1, but we currently have just gone online, and it's sitting outside at the moment of the current organic government-run regulation. So very much as a Māori-led Indigenous pathway for Māori growers. I do want to come back to talking about elevating the mana of soil. And I think about mana, I talked about it before, as social justice, but it's mana is about the authority and the prestige of, yes, it could be a person, yes, it can be communities, but actually in this case, I'm talking about elevating the mana of hine ahu one, of soil. So how might Māori values, how might Indigenous values contribute to strategies for identifying, maintaining and enhancing soil health? And so the Hua Parakore framework has been used as an Indigenous framework for understanding soil health. I'll just keep moving on because I'm conscious of time. And just in winding up with some lovely photos of some of our Hua Parakore producers. It's a participatory guarantee system. So in the third year, it's actually almost like gaining collective consent, and it's the community who bears witness in the everyday to the farmers' practices, who award, along with the Māori Organics Group, the final tohu or the final verification of the Hua Parakore. So this is Geneva and Ray from the far north. Some lovely growers in Whaingaroa in Raglan, food farming on Māori land, receiving their Hua Parakore verification. And then just finally, in wrapping up, I think it's really important in these conversations that, one, that we're drawing on research, but also, too, that we widen the parameters of the research that we're drawing on to include Indigenous knowledges. As a Māori researcher, it's very important that Māori give voice to telling our own stories, and that this is ongoing work for us. And so what we really need to do, what I think really needs to happen in Aotearoa, is we need a big change of the Māori agribusiness sector so that we can start leading out across the large-scale Māori farms to reduce chemical fertilisers, reduce tilling, increase diversity, all of the things that we know are what we need to do in transitioning our food systems. So a couple of books here that have been produced with the Māori Organics Group and with other Māori producers telling their stories of Māori soil sovereignty and Māori food sovereignty. And just in wrapping up, I think I've only got one more slide after this. So what is a kaiatua, a sustainable food system for Māori? It's Indigenous determined, it's driven by Māori values. So we've just seen that through the Hua Parakore system, that is a system of Māori values in our interconnected woven universe. It's absolutely culturally connected to place. So this notion of tūranga waiwai, where we hitch our legs or where we hitch our waka, our canoe up to. And this is why I spent a bit of time at the beginning just being very deliberate about my standpoint, because I suppose I'm not free floating around everywhere. I am very clear about where I'm standing on Māori land, and today I'm standing on Māori land, which I don't whakapapa to. Oh, Chris, I can't. Oh, no, Kate Pai, I was just saying I can't see that. Our food systems are about feeding family first, and they're about ensuring that those genealogical links, that we're working through those whakapapa networks. They have to contribute to Māori soil and food sovereignty, and it's about diversity on all levels. So we obviously, lots of understanding about diversity in agriculture and the importance of it. But what about the need to privilege diverse Māori economies? So, how can we actually step out into different types of economic models, and what are those models? Because for Indigenous communities, we know that FTAs and those WTO agreements never uphold our rights. So what are the other types of economies that we need to engage in? And of course, our food systems are intergenerational. It's about mokopuna decision making. It's about making decisions, in the case of some iwi organisations like Wakatu, 500 years out. Not this year for my benefit or in 5 years' time, but actually 500 years out. What are we thinking about? So just acknowledging Johnson Witihira for the kaupapa Māori design work. We're really working on how we can tell a sustainable Māori food system story through using kaupapa Māori design, and also to Teresa Reihana for her artwork to just explain the Hoa Parakuri standpoint. Nō reira, kia koutou, ngā mihi nui kia koutou.
Te au mangia tēnā rawa tuku e te māreikura, Dr. Jessica Hutchings. Thank you very much for that presentation. I'm glad you acknowledged Teresa Reihana and also Johnson, but particularly Teresa, for those wonderful, magnificent pieces of artwork that you presented throughout your presentation. We've got time for a couple of questions, if that's okay with you. I wouldn't mind posing them. Number one, how open and approachable has the Māori agribusiness sector been to adopting the kai atua Hoa Parakore approach?
I don't think the pathways from government who are really supporting Māori agribusiness, and also too with the work of the Māori trustee, are not set up, I suppose, to promote Hoa Parakore kai atua or those types of systems. So, for example, Julian, as you may know, the Māori trustee, which manages the fragments of Māori land, still use glyphosate. So they're still spraying Roundup on Māori land. So we've got some big work ahead of us. That's a result of colonisation, and the comment at the beginning from yourself about the EU and Aotearoa sharing that agricultural history. Yes, and for Aotearoa, for Māori, that's had a real impact on taking us away from our Māori approaches, mātauranga approaches, from looking after the environment. So it's legacy, and it's going to take a little while to undo that, because we have to do it gently, because we have to, we're talking intergenerational behaviours here, and so we have to unfold those very carefully.
We've got a question also from an audience member, Jessica, from Timothy Williams. Timothy, thank you for the question. This is a great talk. If this certification system was to scale up the number of farmers and consumers, do you see any risks plus strategies for overcoming these and co-optation of values or problems institutionalizing this?
Oh, always problems when we institutionalise it, especially when we bring the colonial government in. So that's why it's really important that it sits outside of those types of systems, but that we're self-determining and we can find those pathways where we do want to interact. I think there's a big risk around IP, and I've had this conversation with various people in Aotearoa about this. Indigenous knowledge, not so much the system being stolen in New Zealand, but in an international context, so just being lifted and taken somewhere else. In saying that, I think the best way to protect Indigenous knowledge is to open it up and to use it, and to not fall into the trap of using Western legal instruments to protect collectivised knowledges. So we have producers in Hawaii, Ma'au farms, who are Hoa Parakuri verified. Because we share same cultural origins, it's very easy for them to translate those values into their own values. And currently talking with Samoan women's farming communities about translating the Hoa Parakuri system so that they can use it in Samoa to really support their farmers back to traditional ways, because and I think that's a beautiful thing for us to do, because that's about connecting up through Te Moana Nui a Kiwa. We also too have had interest from Indigenous communities in Taiwan. But I think before we get globally hot, we've got to make sure that we're doing really good work in Aotearoa with our farmers first. Yeah.
E te tākuta tēnā rawa atu koe. Thank you very much for that presentation, and also for taking time to answer some of the questions we've had. We really appreciate it, Dr. Jessica Hutchings. Ngā mihi nui kia koe. Let's now move to our panel discussion for part of our webinar. And I'm pleased to introduce our 6 practitioners, our 6 panel members, who all live and breathe organic and sustainable agriculture. They are as follows: Dr. Gwen Grolett from Manaaki Whenua Land Care Research, Peter Verheim, European Commission, Head of Unit for Bioeconomy Food Systems, Mark Anderson, he is a regenerative farmer from South Otago, beautiful part of Aotearoa, New Zealand, in the South Island in New Zealand. Alfred Grand from Austria, from Grand Farm and Innovation, and also from the board of the EU Soil Mission. Also joining us is hopefully Felix Mittermeier from Organic Farm, an organic farm owner in Austria. And we're also joined by Maximilian Koch, organic farmer from South Germany. Thank you all for joining us, and I will introduce each speaker individually, and then we'll come to your questions. So please continue to send them to us. We really do appreciate you firing the questions through to us, and we'll get those questions to each panel member. So let's begin and say a big kia ora to Dr. Gwen Grillette. She is a senior researcher at Manaaki Whenua Land Care Research. Gwen is particularly interested in all aspects of interactions and linkages between plants and microbes, how animals influence these linkages, connectivity of the soil and soil food web, and connection between people and the land. So Gwen, tēnā koe, welcome. Great to have you with us today. Let me start by asking the first question, and I know that you're a French national, and I was reading that when you began to study soil ecology on dairy farms in New Zealand in 2016, that you got a rude shock from a soil point of view. You said that the conventional dairy model tuned for maximum milk solid outputs didn't make sense. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, really throwing me in the deep end. Thank you, tēnā koe. Well, when I arrived in New Zealand, all my training was to study natural and managed native ecosystem in the Northern Hemisphere. And so I arrived in New Zealand with a very biased view of the agricultural system here in New Zealand. There was a very green image of New Zealand agricultural exports and from Europe, where I came from. And when I began the project in which I was involved, from an ecological standpoint, I realized that the diversity was extremely low. It was really driven by inputs. The farm that I studied wasn't very far from a local lake that is heavily polluted and has been under threat of eutrophication for quite some time. And so I started to realize that producing food requires a lot of optimization, and working with the landscape is not easy, and there's a lot of constraint and there's a lot of demand to push the system to produce more in a much more efficient manner. There's a lot of constraint on the farmers, especially in New Zealand when the milk industry really took off. Many farmers took a lot of loan and mortgages to set up their production system, the dairy platform, etc. And then they just got locked into that system, and the ability to change and adjust with climate change and realize the kind of the pollution, especially in our rivers. Just to give some quotes, we have 95 to 99% of our rivers traversing our urban agricultural and forestry landscape that are below the acceptable limit. All of this is really contributing to have a system that is not easily changing. And so as a result of that project, I started to look at what other solutions there are, because I completely resonate with some of the thoughts that were shared by our two previous speakers. Change is not easy, and everybody is really struggling to change, and using carrots or sticks has different impact. And from what I've observed, there are people that propose solutions and propose positive vision and an incentive for change rather than sticks and tax and regulation. And this is what I've really started to invest my time in the last 4 years, looking at potential different ways of managing the landscape, such as regenerative agriculture, for example, which is a much more connected, much more integrated, the huge role of mindset, huge recognition that there is an intimate connection between all living beings around us and the land, the people the native species as well as the exotic species, which is a big issue, something that is quite unique to New Zealand compared to some parts of Europe, for example.
Gwen, is an incentive-based approach also an enabler of meeting the targets we heard earlier about the targets that have been set by the EU? Is that incentive-based approach a means by which to be able to expedite processes to be able to meet those targets, like a date of 2030, as mentioned by the EU?
Absolutely. So a little bit like, unlike Jessica, I'm still in the academic system, but I've started to work much more closely with industry. And for me, it's a way of bringing science in the conversation to create a positive change. And so I'm working with industry partners that are really looking at different type of system to present some financial and even mental and infrastructure support for growers and farmers to implement change on their land in a positive manner. So access to a premium or a niche market, but not only that, also developing an infrastructure to be able to monitor the farm, being able to assess what is the carbon footprint, what is the biodiversity footprint, and ultimately, the more investment is put into this, the more, for example, access to European market will be easier. It also allows the farmers to have a constant feedback with their system. So there's also a greater, I think that the food system, we all agree, is suffering from disconnection. There's a huge disconnection between the consumers, the producers. There's a huge disconnection between the brands and the retailers and the processors. And I think there are loads of, some initiatives are designed to repair those connections. And when we are connected, we become aware of the consequence of what we do and our choices. And I think choices have to be made at all levels. So yeah, so incentive, yeah, thank you.
No, thank you very much, Gwen. Appreciate that, and we hope to be able to come back soon with more questions from our audience. I'm now pleased to introduce another of our international speakers. He is Peter Verheim and is the head of unit for the bioeconomy and food system within the Directorate General for Research and Innovation of the European Commission in Brussels. But first, let's take a look at this short video.
Did you know that without healthy soils, there would be no food on your table? That many textiles wouldn't exist? And that there wouldn't even be any wood? If we didn't have healthy soils that filter water, there would be more floods, more droughts, more carbon in the atmosphere, and definitively, less life. In fact, about 25% of European land is affected by water erosion, and the costs associated with soil degradation in the EU may exceed 50 billion euros per year. Without healthy soils, our planet would look very different. We have to make changes. We have to act now. It's our mission to heal the earth together. Healthy soils, healthy planet, healthy people. Caring for soil is caring about life.
Peter, kia ora and welcome, and thank you for joining us. Can you please explain what your role in the European Commission is and how Horizon Europe is supporting the EU's ambition for sustainable food systems?
Good morning to New Zealand, and Julian, excellent to join you in such an inspiring and great sympathetic discussion. Great to learn about Kai Atua and happy to join you in this really conversation around the globe about global food systems, sustainable food systems. My role is in research and innovation, and I'm in the Directorate General in the European Commission that works with research and innovation, and I would like to argue that research and innovation is one of the enablers we see to make these transitions that we in the European Commission would like to trigger and set in motion with the European Green Deal and the farm to fork strategy that has been mentioned before. Let me maybe also argue that in the past, we have also seen a lot of research and innovation efforts related to agriculture and food systems. But very often these efforts have focused very much on productivity growth, and these efforts have helped us to reach very high levels of food security and very high levels of productivity in agriculture and in food systems in Europe. But obviously, this has come at a high cost. We have seen that there are environmental costs associated with it, health costs associated with it. And therefore, I think there has been a paradigm change during the last 10 years that research and innovation for the food system needs also to have a systems approach, that we do not only need to look at one target at the same time, but instead we need to look at different objectives and targets at the same time. We need to look at ecological, economic, and social objectives and dimensions of sustainability. And in that spirit, we have a research innovation program which we call Horizon Europe. That's the EU's research innovation program. In that, we have give a lot of attention to agriculture, food systems, natural resources, and the bioeconomy. And with Horizon Europe, this is the name of our new research and innovation program. We have also started to innovate. We have introduced novelties, which we call missions, research missions that go beyond the past practice of just having individual smaller research projects. And these missions have been inspired to some extent even by Apollo 11 mission and to put a man on the moon. They are integral part of Horizon Europe. They were launched this year in September. And one of these missions is on soil health. And they are really demand-led, very ambitious, tangible goals, and they are expected to scale up solutions and deliver impactful change related to systemic transitions. And one of them is, as I said, what we call a soil deal for Europe, with which we want to develop 100 living labs and lighthouses to lead the transition towards healthy soils by 2030. This is one of the novelties and innovation, and this mission aims at putting Europe on a trajectory towards sustainable soil management and restoration as part of a wider green transition in rural and urban areas, simply because healthy soils are the basis for nutritious and safe food. Soil are multifunctional. They deliver vital interconnected ecosystem functions like water regulation, hosting biodiversity, nutrient cycling, climate mitigation, and adaptation. And they are very closely related to the Green Deal targets and the Farm to Fork targets, which Jeroen has outlined in the beginning of this seminar. Yet we see that soils in Europe are threatened. 60 to 70% of soils in Europe are unhealthy, and due to current management practices, pollution or urbanization, and the effects of climate change. And hence, we decided we need to address this societal challenge through really an impactful, large-scale mission, which is this soil deal for Europe. Let me stop here.
Peter, thank you very much for that, Peter. Can you also explain where the EU sees a need for a gap to be filled with research and innovation and solutions to help farmer transition to less extractive types of operations?
I think in the first presentation of this seminar by Jerome, it became evident that we have many challenges facing agriculture and food systems. And in each of these challenges, I think the need is to look at the entire system relations and the interlinkages and identify systems solutions that provide win-win solutions in view of economic, social, and ecological aspects. Let me give an example which we have heard before, the example of the climate challenge, and certainly agriculture and the farming sector, the food systems need to make a contribution to mitigate the effects on climate change. And there are various ways agriculture can reduce emissions from fertilizer use, methane emissions from livestock use, but also can make positive contributions by generating negative emissions or through carbon sequestration in soils. And here again, we need to utilize research and innovation to identify win-win solutions that work for the farmers and for the society. And there are a variety of different solutions possible. Feed additives to reduce methane emissions from livestock, technologies to measure and monitor organic carbon in soils, utilizing on-site testing, but also developing the regulatory framework to reward farmers for carbon soil sequestration. And all of these aspects are currently work in progress and are looked at by researchers funded through our European Research Framework Program, Horizon Europe.
Thank you very much, Peter. Really appreciate those answers to those questions. We'll have more, I'm sure, coming in from the audience a bit later on. Let's now return back here to Aotearoa, New Zealand now, and introduce Mark Anderson with wife Madeline and their 3 children. They work a 580-hectare dairy farm in Wairua South in South Otago. It is their 4th year into the journey of realigning farm operations to work alongside nature, milking 750 cows once a day, holistically grazed on taller, diverse pastures and mixed species forage crops. Now, the farm also winters the cows in a way in which enhance and accelerate soil health and ecological services. And their vision is to repair the broken biological cycles industrial agriculture has set upon the industry, returning the health of the land, animals, and the people. Now, Mark, welcome, and I believe you've got a presentation to kick off.
Yes, thank you so much. I'll just share my screen. Okay, you see that? Okay, thank you. So thanks so much for having me here today. It's a real privilege, and I'm really honoured to be here amongst some amazing people. I'll move fast as we have some really important presentations still to come. So this was a family farm, and it's been a dairy farm for 26 years. 5 years ago, due to multiple tension events, we decided to go on a different path and on a journey towards regeneration. So we felt sustainable was too low of a bar, and we wanted to go further and faster towards a system that could decouple from high fossil energy use on farm. And yeah, the practices we thought the practices we were doing, we thought they couldn't be sustained into the future. And these are the main systems changes we went through. So we identified our purpose, values, and mindset, and we really worked hard on those. We had help from coaches and mentors. The other changes on farm, we changed to once-a-day milking so we could really focus on holistic grazing, and so that our staff could be more involved with the day-to-day running and have more diversity in their day-to-day jobs. We changed our breeds. We moved to multi-species diverse pastures, grazing techniques, which I touched on. We changed from fertilising to composting. Our winter regime changed, and the pathway to becoming a closed-loop, self-contained system still continues today. So we moved to diverse pastures and a different wintering system on farm. We think that the animals, just like humans, should have a varied mixed diet, and we began grazing a little taller, but allowing full plant recovery, grazing at the 3 to 4 leaf stage. When we wait for full plant recovery, we see other species volunteering back into the sward. So we were actually increasing species diversity just with our grazing management. We've also introduced more species with through different methods of direct drilling. So some of the major benefits we're seeing from this is better nutrient cycling. We're seeing minerals increase in our soils without adding non-renewable petroleum-based fertilizers. We're seeing better water infiltration. The natural cycles are working better. Soil organic matter is increasing. Animal health is much better. We're seeing positives. We're seeing lower milk urea levels, which would mean urinary N is lower as well. So yes, we're seeing many benefits there. When we progressed towards a no-bare soil policy, we wanted to winter animals in a low-impact way. So we moved towards standing pasture and hay bales. And this has given us some real flexibility with the animals, and we're really happy with how that's working on the land compared to what we were doing in the past. So we're introducing different breeds as well. So here we're using Viking Reds, Normandies. We're introducing breeds that are dual purpose, meat and milk. And these animals show really great animal health traits, udder health, etc., which is really important moving forward when we're seeing antimicrobial resistance and other health-related issues occurring among herds. So yeah, these animals have really good foraging capabilities as well. So as we move to get excited about silvopasture and agroforestry in our systems, these breeds are going to be well suited to our taller grazing and foraging for the future. Yeah. So just finishing up with converting all our synthetic fertilizer application towards biostimulants and composting. Really inspired by Elaine Ingham and the Soil Food Web, Nicole Masters, so many people reading Jessica's book as well. So yeah, we're integrating the compost into a farm system, and this is to help us grow a really fungal dominant compost to apply to the land. And just basically we're really working on reducing scope 1 and 2 emissions from the farm, and we see this as a really great pathway to use on-farm resources as compost material, what before we might have seen as waste. So yeah, there's amazing farmers in New Zealand, and they've got this opportunity. They've got choices. There's a lot of pressure coming on with regarding environment, social, and economic. And this really has showed us a pathway where we can move forward without detrimental effects on the environment.
Mark, thank you very much for that presentation. And I know you've said also that, quote, weaning the farm off fertiliser is a bit like a drug rehab program. It's hard to go cold turkey. Can you tell us about that journey, and in particular the challenges perhaps in undertaking that journey?
Yeah, it was certainly it was like an inward battle first. You had to work on your mindset and really convince yourself that just to choose this pathway, and then it was really an outward battle, because once you started to implement these practices, it was totally different to what the mainstream industry was doing. So there's a heavy weight on farmers to adopt change, and some of the other presenters have touched on that really well. So yeah, it's certainly challenging, but there's supportive groups growing, peer-to-peer learning groups, and farmers coming together, and that's really helping us learn more and move forward.
Mark, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. And again, if we've got some time at the end, we hope to come back to the panelists as well with questions from the audience. Moving next now to Alfred Grand from Austria, Grand Farm and Innovation, and the board of the EU Soil Mission. Now, Alfred is an organic arable field farmer, market gardener, and entrepreneur from Austria. Alfred is a member of the 3 soil-related EIP agri-focus groups, the 3 EIP agri-operational groups, and several Horizon 2020 projects. He is also the co-author of the book, Make Your Own Fertilizer. Alfred, welcome. It's great to have you with us as well, and I understand we're going to play a very short video.
Exactly, hello and welcome. My name is Alfred Grand. I am an organic farmer and entrepreneur. As an entrepreneur, we are producing organic fertilizer with the help of earthworms. As a farmer, together with my family and a young motivated team, we have a research and demonstration farm. We are based in Absdorf in Austria, in the heart of Europe. Our main topics on the farm are soil health, which is the foundation for every farmer, agroforestry, which is bringing back trees and bushes on arable land, and market gardening. Market gardening is really a very special system. It's traditional, but yet extremely innovative. It produces high-quality organic vegetables, fruits and herbs on small land, not so much with technology, but more with people. It is the best example for a systemic approach to the societal challenges that we are facing today. It has the potential to mitigate climate change, to adapt to climate change. It regenerates your soil, and it produces healthy food at the same time. It creates jobs for young people in rural areas and has a high value to the local economy. We are doing research together with national and international research institutes on market gardening, because we think this is the way to go. Our vision is to establish a market garden in every larger village within Europe. till 2035.
Well, thank you, Alfred, and welcome again. It's great to have you with us, and thank you for that video as well. Alfred, how important is it that we restore the quality of soil in our farms, and what changes do farmers need to make?
I think it's fundamental to restore our soils because, as other speakers already mentioned, soil is at risk, and soil provides several functions. One of the most important functions is the productivity function. So it provides the food, it provides the textile, the fiber, the feed for the livestock, and also some fuel. But also it provides biodiversity. It infiltrates and manages water, and much more. It's a sequester carbon. So soil is really, really important, and we have to raise awareness on a farmer's level, what we do with our demonstration activity, but we also have to raise awareness on the consumer level.
And Alfred, you're also on the board of the European Commission Soil Mission. What initiatives are being undertaken by the mission, and what results are you seeing at the moment?
Yeah, I was selected as one of the 15 board members to propose ideas for the mission. And now the mission will be implemented, as already mentioned by Peter in front of me. And one of the key things is that we will create 100 living labs, 100 regions where not the typical normal soil science will go on, but it will be a cooperation between research and practitioners on one side, but also including society, including politicians, including NGOs, to work together, because what we need to do, we need a more systemic approach, we need a more holistic approach, and we have to work together because as a society globally, we are facing huge challenges, which were already mentioned: climate change, loss of biodiversity, environmental pollution, things like that, but also societal challenges that we are facing. And we can only try to solve these problems if we work together. So it's not only on the shoulders of the scientists to solve these problems, but we all have to contribute and we all have to work together. Otherwise, it's nearly impossible to solve all these challenges.
Thank you very much, Alfred. And again, we will come back to you soon with questions from the audience, but thank you again for those introductory comments and also for the answers to those questions. We now turn to Maximilian Koch. He is an organic farmer from South Germany and a member of a supervisory board of a dairy cooperative since 2005. He also did his internship in New Zealand in 2001 before taking over the family-owned organic farm in South Germany, farming 110 hectares of rough country, 800 meters above sea level. Maximilian, welcome, and it's awesome to have you on the panel. Thank you very much for joining us. There'll be interest from our New Zealand audience, obviously, in your apprenticeship here in New Zealand in 2001, and yet you returned to Germany to work in the family farm. Tell us what you learned in New Zealand that you were able to take back to Germany, and what didn't potentially work for you when you did that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope you hear me. Yeah. Yeah, first of all, please excuse my English. You've listened to great speakers. It's been quite a while that I've been to New Zealand, and yeah, my English is not the best, but yeah, I try to answer your questions, and I've had a great time in New Zealand, and I learned a lot there, especially about the system, like having the cows outside the whole year and feeding pretty much only grass, and that's what I think is a very sustainable way of agriculture, like producing milk with only grass. This is what we try to do here, and what a lot of farmers learn and try to do for quite a while. Like my parents started with organic farming about 20 years ago, and we've always been very happy with this decision. What I want to say about sustainability is like you need to earn money with organic farming. And you need if the farmers do not get enough for their products, it's not sustainable. So what we try to do is like show to other farmers that organic farming is working. And like in Germany, a lot of farmers convert to organic farming between 2015 and 2020. It's been 8,000 farmers in Germany converted to organic farming, and I think this is the reason, because they see it is working. We have stable prices. Like the common farmers, they always have these ups and downs, and they are arguing about a lot of stuff. And what I think is like the organic way is a chance for a lot of farmers. Less stress for the farmers themselves, for their animals. Like animal welfare is a big thing here in Germany. Like when I go to school, I learn to push the animals as far as you can. Milk 10,000 liters per cow per year. But now what I think is policy is changing, and like the people want to they want to have another way of agriculture as well.
Maximilian, can you talk to us also about your thoughts about the development and future of the organic market for farmers?
Yeah, as a member of the supervisory board of our dairy factory, I see some things what happens on the market, and like what happens is, like we have in Germany, we have 4 big companies who rule the whole market about food pretty much. And at the moment, especially for organic products, they want to buy stuff from Germany only. So they try to find farmers who produce for certain labels on a very, very high quality level, but they also pay. They try to pay good money for those products. So what I think the organic farming will be a good chance for a lot of farmers, and I think this market will grow, and for our country and for our for climate and everything, this is the only way to get the problems solved. This is one big way to fight those problems.
Thank you, Maximilian. Thank you very much for the answers to those questions. If I can come back to our panel now, we've got questions from audience. One particularly to you, Gwen, if I can put this one to you. And knowing that you've got a lot of research that you have undertaken, particularly on your multifaceted approach to soil science, combining natural sciences with complex system science and social science research methods. And I know we won't have time to have you talk about all of your research, but the question is, can you tell us how you've made your transdisciplinary approaches within the science community, how you've made that happen in practice, and what you've learned about the process?
Okay, thank you very much. That's a really good question. So in New Zealand currently in the ag sector, we have platforms that are called National Science Challenge that are designed to enable these transdisciplinary approaches. So for those in the audience that are not familiar with that word, it means not only working across multiple disciplines of science, but also working with multiple sectors of the society that are concerned with the topic that we are researching. So it's a bit like these innovation and mission-orientated platforms that are being created by the EU as part of Horizon 2020. It's not. It is not an easy thing to do because we all come with our worldview. So above and beyond Indigenous worldview versus Western science worldview, within each of these, there's also different worldview, and we all come with biases in the way we are seeing things. So as an ecologist, I'm not going to see an agroecosystem in the same way as somebody who's worked for 20 or 30 years at optimizing efficiency of our agroecosystem. So what we've done is we basically did based our approach in a model that are called agent-based modeling. And so what we've done is we split the work that we did in little modules, and we had funding from the National Science Challenge and also for a philanthropic organization, the Next Foundation. And we had a lot of support as in-kind funding from a lot of individual private partners like technical experts and also research organization and industry. This is important because it means that people were buying into the process. So we put together about 200 people and over 80 organizations, and the idea was to ask them to think about what would be the main question to ask if we wanted to bring together the science and the practitioners and explore whether, for example, regenerative agriculture could be a pathway and a solution forward for New Zealand to future-proof our agricultural system, to restore the balance between the finance that goes to our farmers and what is just taken by the processors and the rest of the value chain, and how we could help that. We could help restore our biodiversity and soil quality and water quality issue. And all these people had some level of independence as well as overarching guideline. And I think for me, that's the clue. The key is to make sure that we have a combined, dare I say, top-down and bottom-up approach. Because I think just a pure top-down approach, which is usually driven regulation, taxes, etc., is not going to work because people are not going to buy into the process. Having just a community-based and sort of grassroots movement is also quite chaotic. And so having the two together and fostering diversity of solution for me, that's the key forward. And so that can be applied to research as well as transition of our agri-food system.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gwen. Appreciate the answer to that question. Peter, we have a question to you from Gregory Millen, referencing COP26, the new international carbon trading system, and the reductions in fossil fuels use. How is emission offsetting envisaged to fit into the EU bioeconomy and then the global system?
That's a very good and pertinent question. Overall, obviously, as also Sharon has indicated in the beginning, the European Green Deal, Farm to Fork are also inspired by our international obligations, and agriculture and the food system should also make a contribution to reducing emissions and or to generate negative emissions. But it's a long way to go because the carbon cycles related to agriculture, livestock production, fertilizer use, carbon sequestration in soils are very complex. They are driven by nature. They are not as straightforward as in industry. Therefore, we need to do a lot of work on research and innovation to get the science right, but we also need to do work on the regulatory side. And in fact, the EU has already a regulatory framework to include the emissions and removals from in agriculture, in land use, in forestry, into our overall climate policy framework. We are trying to build that up in a stepwise approach, but it's still far away from really being included in a market-based emission trading system.
Thank you, Peter, for that answer. Appreciate that. Look, I'm sorry to all our panel members. We do have a number of questions coming through, but I do need to now introduce, and actually it's a privilege now to introduce Her Excellency Nina Obermeyer, the Ambassador for the European Union, or of the European Union, to Aotearoa, New Zealand, for some final comments. Prior to arriving to Aotearoa, New Zealand, Ambassador Obermeyer spent 3 years working as an advisor to the Deputy Chief Negotiator for the UK withdrawal from the European Union. She was lead negotiator for issues related to Ireland and Northern Ireland, and prior to this, the ambassador was responsible for relations with Switzerland. A German citizen, she has also worked for German media. Aside from her mother tongue, Nina also speaks English, French, and Dutch. Your Excellency, Ambassador Nina Obermeyer, tēnā koe and welcome.
Tēnā koe, Julian. Nā minui kia koutou katoa. Thank you very much to all our amazing speakers. Jeroen, Gwen, Jessica, Alfred, Peter, Felix, and Maximilian. I'm so glad that we had such a varied and interesting discussion with all these different perspectives. And if you bear with me for just a minute, I'd like to outline briefly why we're doing this, why the EU is organizing webinars such as the one you're participating in today. And you could see from Jeroen's initial comments at the beginning that this is not a propaganda exercise. It's not to showcase everything that is wonderful about the EU, but also to ask the important questions that still need to be answered, because we're all in this together, he waka ike noa, and we very much believe as the European Union that by bringing people together, to talk about the different perspectives, only in this way can we bring about the change that is so desperately needed in order to keep global temperature rise to 1.5% and to move to a more sustainable economy and society in the next couple of years. And very impressive to listen to some of the transition stories that we heard today. I think if I've got to put this onto a common denominator, I'd like to say that the EU and Aotearoa, New Zealand, whilst we are, of course, separated by a huge geographical distance, we're united by shared pride of and concern for our strong agricultural roots and traditions. And of course, I'd like to acknowledge Jessica's perspective on this, in particular when it comes to the impact that traditional agriculture had on Maori land. However, this being said, I think it is fair to say that the discussion reminded us that farmers have been and will continue to be the stewards, the kaitiaki of our land. And through this incredibly challenging and complicated period that lies ahead of us with the green transition. Farmers have kept us fed and have kept us supported with everything we need. And only by bringing together urban and rural communities as we think about how to redesign food systems, and whilst governments can help, nothing can replace discussions between those who have direct experiences and work on this daily. And this is why we are holding seminars like this, and this is what EU climate diplomacy is about. Thank you all very much for connecting today. I'd like to wish everybody a good night in Europe and a wonderful day in Aotearoa. Thank you very much.
Your Excellency, Ambassador Nino Mbaya, thank you. And I've done you a disservice. I should have said you spoke your mother tongue as well as English, French, Dutch, and Te Reo Māori. Tēnā koe. Tēnā koe. Ngā mihi nui ki a koe. Thank you very much. And also our thanks to our participants as a part of this very special webinar today. My thanks to our speakers, Dr. Jeroen Candel, Dr. Jessica Hutchings, Peter Verheim, Dr. Gwen Grillette, Alfred Grand, Mark Anderson, and Maximilian Koch. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Thank you all very much. And again, apologies for the time that we had or unable to have to be able to ask more questions of our panel. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to hear your collective contribution and to hear the way that the food of the future could and should be produced. My thanks also to those of you who have joined us today. A number of you have been with us today. We really appreciate your time in joining us as a part of this webinar. And may I close this webinar by saying the following words. It's a well-known Māori proverbial utterance. It says, kia hora te marino kia hakapapaunamu te moana kia tere te kā rohi. May the seas before you all be calm. May they glisten like greenstone. And may the shimmer of summer dance across your pathway now and forevermore. Kia ora tātou katoa.